I'm really excited about some of the things you'll hear today, some of the issues we will tackle together, and certainly looking forward to hearing from our first speaker, Vince Schiraldi. Vince's talk is titled, Has Community Corrections Grown Too Big to Succeed? Of course, a play on Too Big to Fail. He is known as a fearless reformer dedicated to treating people humanely, something we deeply believe in here in Oregon. So as he comes to the stage, I do want to also make a note that all of you, a logistical note, all of you standing in the back, we have lots of chairs in front, so come on up so we can hear Vince, and I will now welcome him to the stage.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you very much. Happy Valentine's Day. Happy birthday. Now I have a really good excuse when I go back to New York to say to my wife, no, it wasn't like I left on Valentine's Day. I went on Oregon's 160th birthday, so I'm pretty sure that's not going to fly. But this is like super exciting. I've never been to a state-level conference with this many people and this much sort of different span of what people do, you know, all the different walks of life that are in the room, focused on this 1,400 people in this really cool high-tech room. You know, it's super exciting, the stuff the governor just talked about, and the ending with treating people like they're your neighbors, not like they're some category of criminal that you want to shun, was a great clarion call to the beginning of it, and it's just very, very exciting to see what you're doing here and to be a little part of this conversation today. Let's see now if the technology works. Yeah. So this is the way my presentation is going to flesh itself out today. I've been looking at probation and parole for a lot of years. As a researcher, I was also Commissioner of New York City Probation for 4 years under Mayor Bloomberg. So I'm going to talk a little about the national context for probation and parole for community corrections, some bit of the story here in Oregon, discussion about why it would be important to downsize both the size of probation and parole and the return of people to prison for particularly technical violations, the national consensus that's growing up around that professionally and even now amongst entertainers and sports teams and things like that, what other places are doing, and some implications. So probation and parole started in the U.S. in the 1800s. We actually were credited with founding probation. Shoemaker in Boston started showing up at court and saying, don't put these people in stocks and lock them up. Let me watch them, and return to court. And in the early 1800s, in the mid-1800s, in Sing Sing, we're credited with our own version of parole. It started earlier in Europe. No one could have imagined in that hyper-individualistic and rehabilitative alternative to incarceration, that sort of small experiment that started back then, that we grow in ways that this chart represents. At our peak, topping 5 million people, now at about 4.5 million people on probation and parole. More people than live in half of all U.S. states, more people than live here in Oregon, for example, are under supervision nationally. It's probably an undercount because many states don't report how many people are on probation for misdemeanors. And that's about twice as many as are locked up in all of our jails and prisons. So you hear a lot about mass incarceration, not quite as much about mass supervision, but there's twice as many people under supervision as on probation and parole. Ostensibly, although there's some argument amongst historians, it was designed to reduce the number of people we were punishing or to reduce their length of punishment. But you can see from this chart, this is just a gross look, but you could see this also when you look at it state by state. In some states, not all occasions, but sometimes, it's not really serving as an alternative to incarceration. If it was, when it was going up, the incarceration number should go down. And when it's coming down, the incarceration number should go up. It's pretty clear, and I think from the research and literature in the field now, that probation and parole are really an add-on and that they've changed their focus in that respect. And much of that happened during the ramp up to mass incarceration in the 70s, 80s, and 90s, when probation changed its ethic and its culture to be a more punitive one and a more supervisorial one as opposed to a rehabilitative and supportive one. Some of that's changing, especially with the evidence-based practice movement, but still the massive number of people under probation and parole is now serving very often as a tripwire back into incarceration instead of an alternative to incarceration. Part of that is because as it grew, it never accrued the kinds of resources that it needed to do the job. Politicians often treat it as if it's just a free thing. There's very serious sort of notion that if we're going to build more prisons, and you heard the governor talk about it, it's going to cost us more money. Often politicians do things that increase the number of people on probation and parole and don't send the resources that way. So that puts the probation or parole officer in a situation of being in a sometimes risk-averse, often cash-starved environment, working with increasing numbers of folks that have legitimate issues that they need to grapple with: substance abuse, mental health problems, homelessness, educational and workforce issues, but with insufficient resources. And so the only way you can spend $60-ish thousand, depends on the cost per state, of state resources on a person on your caseload is to file a revocation. You don't have $60,000 worth of housing or education or employment or substance abuse always available to you. You almost always have $60,000 worth of prison or jail, resulting in sometimes people being revoked for things that arguably they shouldn't. I had a difficult time assessing the data on Oregon in terms of where you stand nationally. If you look at this sort of is both your probation and parole numbers that are funded by the Department of Corrections, which means it doesn't include most misdemeanors, most folks on probation for misdemeanors. But it's been hovering around 30,000 between 2000 and 2018, according to your state data. Here's a breakdown by probation and parole. You could see paroles, and I'm using the word parole. Most people are on post-prison supervision here. So parole's been going up a little bit, and probation's been declining a little bit. And they're about meeting around 15,000. If you ask the feds how many people are on probation and parole in Oregon, they'll say twice as many as that. The federal data for 2016 reported 61,400, and when you ask them, they say they get that from the state. So y'all got to figure that one out. I couldn't do it in the amount of time that I had available to me. It puts you, generally speaking, either, particularly with the parole data, if the parole data the feds are reporting are accurate, and that's about 25,000 people on parole, then you're towards the top of the number of people being supervised nationally. If not, you're around the middle of the pack on both. And I think it's important to know if you care about how you stand versus other states. You do, according to the Pew Center for the States, you have the highest rate of supervising people post-prison of any state in the country. And there's no early discharge for people on parole allowable in the state of Oregon. So it would make sense that you were towards the upper end with both of those phenomena. But I'm not going to say that as a conclusive thing today because the data wouldn't bear it out. Staying with this just for half a second longer, because I know if I talk about it too much longer, people are going to start checking emails and nodding out, going to the bathroom. But I want to stay with it just a half second longer, just relative to parole. If the federal number's right, you're supervising people on parole at twice the rate, twice the national average, a little more than twice the national average. But even if they're not right, even if your data's right, you're 50% higher than a national average in terms of the people you supervise on parole. With respect to how long you can be on probation, there was a study by the Rabina Institute at the University of Minnesota that looked at as many states as would respond to them. Oregon is about in the middle of the pack, I think a fair assessment of that would be in terms of how long you can get on probation if you are convicted of a felony, and towards the upper end of how much time you can get on probation if you're convicted of a misdemeanor. Only Pennsylvania allows people to be on for the maximum term allowable for that crime, and Oregon's part of a handful of states that allow you to be on misdemeanor probation for 5 years. My understanding, again, there's not terrific data on misdemeanor probation in Oregon because it's not paid for by the state and therefore isn't collected at the same level. That there's a lot of split sentences going on at the misdemeanor level. The Council of State Governments did this analysis on splits in Pennsylvania and found that there was no benefit to post-release, post-jail, or post-prison probation. That basically people who just went to prison and came out, or jail and came out, and people who were on jail or prison plus post-release probation did about the same in terms of recidivism. Many more people exiting parole and probation are exiting, many more people exiting parole and probation in Oregon to incarceration are exiting not for new crimes but for technicals. 23% of those exiting parole in 2016 were incarcerated without a new sentence. That's 2.4 times as many people as were incarcerated for a new crime. 1 out of 5 people entering your prisons in 2013 were incarcerated for a probation violation. You're 8 times as likely to be incarcerated for a technical as for a new offense if you're on probation in Oregon. So, why does all this matter? Well, one is it's a deprivation of liberty in its own right. I don't think we spend enough time thinking about that. When I was probation commissioner, we started having a lot of conferences like this, nowhere near as cool technology and nowhere near as many people in the room, but we put all our staff, had about 1,000 staff. There were almost 30,000 people on probation at the time. And one of the things we did was we started bringing people on probation and their family members to be parts of the panels. And many of my staff said they actually never had an opportunity just to sort of talk to somebody outside of, their busy days when they're trying to get the next person and then the next person and then the next person, and just about what it's like to be on probation and parole. And I think when you do that, when you spend time doing it, it's really a lot more oppressive than I think most of us imagine. Partly perhaps because we think of it as comparison to jail. It always seems like sort of a slap on the wrist or a grant of mercy. And if it is indeed an alternative to jail, and then perhaps you could even justify it that way. But with the evidence increasingly showing that it's really an alternative to freedom, I think it's quite important to ask ourselves why, whether that deprivation of liberty is necessary, even that mini deprivation of liberty. And then, of course, it's a tripwire back to incarceration for some people, often for not committing new crimes, but for violating some technical condition. It always struck me in my conversations with legislators particularly that there was just a sense that if some probation and some parole was good, then more must be better. And I think we really need to push back against that. More is not necessarily always better, particularly for people who score low risk. There's lots of evidence that shows that supervising people and even programming people who are low risk on probation makes them worse. They recidivate at higher rates. Why is that? It's a let me pause over that for a moment. Part of the reason people say is that, well, you're going to sit in that waiting room waiting to see your PO, and you're low risk, and you're sitting in between 2 high-risk guys, and you're going to become high risk. And I think that's not untrue, but I think there's also another part of it that is sort of what makes people low risk when you look at some of the risk assessment instruments is your attachments to the community. And just because people have committed crimes and are on probation doesn't mean they don't have attachments to the community. They got mothers, they got fathers, they got priests, they work jobs, they do all sorts of things that we all do. And lots more evidence shows that it's those attachments that help you be lower risk, because those are the things that are going to be with you for the rest of your life, as opposed to 1 to 5 years while you're on probation. And so by putting people on probation who are low risk, who might have strong attachments to other things that are going to make the bridge from their offending behavior to a life that's not characterized by offending behavior, we somewhat detach them from those supports and opportunities, and replace them with less effective and of course temporary government attachments. Lengthy supervision terms, of course, strain departmental resources and put people at risk of incarceration for technical violations, for not particularly serious things. When I was a commissioner, we got a bill passed. In New York, the rules were 5 years for a felony, 3 years for a misdemeanor, and the judge had no choice. That's all they could do. They could give you 5 years if they put you on probation for a felony. And so I had to, we tried to get a bill passed and did succeed to reduce that to 5, 4, or 3 years. So the judges now had a choice for felonies and 3 or 2 years for misdemeanors. And so I had to lobby the legislature because this was a New York City bill, and Mayor Bloomberg let me go do it. And so, sitting with them talking, it was just really super interesting, right? Because they're dealing with like a million things. They knew almost nothing about probation. Mostly they were concerned with, is this going to make me look like I'm soft on crime? But it gave me a good opportunity. It was like a little mini focus group to say, what do you think the conversation's like 5 years into probation for somebody that's been doing well at 1, 2, 3, and 4 years? Like, can you help me find a bigger waste of government dollars in New York State than keeping a guy on probation for 5 years who at 3 years was doing fine? And at some point they were like, okay, yeah, let's move on. Like, we're done. And it passed. It passed unanimously in the Republican-controlled Senate, by the way. Diminishing returns, like I said, my little story right there, but most people reoffend in the first 1 or 2 years, so pretty much every dollar you're spending on supervision beyond that is, by definition, achieving diminishing returns. And then stark racial disparities. The governor just talked about that. Very impressive data about the law reform she mentioned. There's pretty good data on revocations under supervision being disparate by race. African Americans being revoked more frequently for similar behavior and similar prior records, and about 3.5 times as many African Americans are under supervision as whites as a rate. Okay, so let's talk a little about Oregon. Let's go back to your state for a second. So I have a series of questions I want to just put out for folks to think about that struck me from the data I was able to review before I came. First, should you be discharging more people early from probation? Excuse me. So, people on probation who have complied and paid their restitution can be discharged here at 50% of that time. Last year, only 7.9% of all the people on probation were discharged early. All the people who were eligible to be discharged were discharged early, but 60% of them ultimately complete probation successfully. So given how many people are ultimately succeeding, could you be discharging more people early? Should a broader range of options be used when people do technically violate? Of those in Oregon sanctioned for technical and non-conviction violations, no new conviction for a new crime. Most of them, by the way, were pure technicals, not arrests that didn't result in convictions. 83% went to jail. That means that out of 32,787 sanctions you gave last year, a little over 27,000 were jailed. Could you be using other options? Could you be using cognitive behavioral therapy, community service, any level of intermediate options short of jailing those folks? Folks who complete transitional leave. Transitional leave, for those of you who don't know, is in the last 120 days before you're coming out of prison, certain eligible prisoners are able to go to a sort of less secure, community-based environment prior to fully being released. Vastly successful, usually successful. 92% of those who successfully complete transitional leave don't return to prison. It's a much lower recidivism rate than the rest of your prison population. It saved 424,000 prison beds. But all of them have to be on 3 years of post-prison supervision, and none of them can have early discharge. Do you need to have them all? Do you need to have them on supervision at all? And do you need to have them on supervision for 3 years, each one of them? And then finally, Governor talked about this new legislation downgrading a bunch of felony possession cases to misdemeanor possession cases. 44% of the folks on probation for misdemeanor possession of a controlled substance scored low risk on your risk assessment instrument. Low, as I mentioned earlier, they're not, low risk people tend to get worse, not better when you supervise them, and my understanding is that as you prioritize what you do with people on probation and parole, you're not giving a lot of attention to people who score low risk and were convicted of misdemeanors. So in an era of limited resources, do you need to have them on probation at all? These are just a couple of questions for you to think about during the time. So this is getting increasing national attention, the issues of mass supervision as it pertains to mass incarceration. The Harvard Kennedy School had a 3-year executive session where it brought people from around the country to practitioners and researchers together to discuss issues of community corrections. It's the first time one of their executive sessions, and they've done them on policing and prosecution and defense, it's one of the first times one of their executive sessions ever came up with a consensus document. It's the only time it's ever come up with a consensus document. So everybody agreed on a set of principles relative to community corrections. And those were to promote well-being and the safety of communities, to use the capacity to arrest, discipline, and incarcerate parsimoniously. In other words, in no greater number than is needed to get the job done, to recognize the worth, the self-worth of justice-involved individuals, to promote the rule of law, and to infuse justice and fairness into the system. The Kennedy School came out with a series of recommendations in that same consensus document. There were 14, I'll mention a couple, moving from mass supervision to focused supervision, moving from time-based to goal-based supervision, and from deficit-based to strengths-based. So try to build on people's assets rather than just extinguish their deficits. A couple of statements they made is that supervision should focus only on those who pose a high risk of reoffending, and it should last for periods no longer than are necessary or just, generally not more than 1 or 2 years. Individuals under supervision should be rewarded for improved behavior with a variety of incentives, including reducing the time they spend under supervision and or eliminating their supervision fees. One of the last papers that executive sessions put out, I co-authored with Mike Jacobson, and another exec session member who was also formerly Commissioner of New York City Probation and Commissioner of the Department of Corrections in New York City, and then ran the Vera Institute of Justice. And as we put it out, we released it at the American Probation and Parole Association Conference in 2017. And as we were discussing the paper with many of the leading APPA members, folks were, there was actually a lot of agreement. This is not an outlier in the field. Many people who run probation departments, large and small, urban and rural, red states and blue states, were saying that there's too many people on probation. It's just handed out too frequently. People are stuck on it for too long. And the field itself was heavily in agreement. And so as we were discussing creating the panel that released the paper, we started to create a statement on the future of community corrections with some APPA leaders. And it's up online, and I'll provide the link for the full text to the conference organizers, but it's sort of preamble said, as America's leading probation and parole officials and other concerned individuals and organizations, we recommend that the number of people on probation and parole supervision in America be significantly reduced by reserving community corrections for those who truly need it, reducing lengths of stay, parsimony in conditions, not just loading them on, but sort of carefully picking which conditions matter, incentivizing progress by granting early discharge, eliminating fees, and preserving the savings to use to improve people's lives and improve public safety. This was signed on to by 35 community corrections, current and former administrators, including Scott. Scott, are you here? Where are you, Scott? From Multnomah? There he is, including Scott from Multnomah, and 45 district attorneys, and every probation and parole organization representing probation and parole in the country. So the American Probation and Parole Association, National Association of Probation Executives, et cetera. And then, of course, I don't know if you've seen, but since Meek Mill, the Philadelphia rapper, was violated on probation 11 years into his probation service, there's been a big increase in football team owners, Robert Kraft, basketball team owners, musicians, coming out in arguing for probation and parole reform. So this is the money shot of the presentation. There we go. That's the kickoff of the reform. My niece emailed me right away and said, "Oh my God, you're in a photo with Jay-Z." And I said, "Do you think Jay-Z's niece is emailing him and saying, 'Oh my God, you're in a photo with Vince?'" She suggested perhaps no, that wasn't happening. But they drummed up $50 million in 6 months after Meek Mill was violated and returned to prison. He's now out on bail, and they're going to be advocating, litigating, pushing for legislation, pushing for administrative reforms around the country. It's going to be very interesting to see what comes of that. So a bunch of states have done things to very specifically reduce the number of people on probation and parole, reduce the number of people being revoked. Arizona passed the Safe Communities Act in 2008. They gave credit time off, essentially for good behavior on probation, 30 days off for every 30 days you didn't get a violation, and mandated pre-sentence risk needs assessments and evidence-based training of their staff. 29% decline in violations over the next 8 years, 21% decline in arrests for people on probation, and $392 million in averted jail and prison costs. Missouri similarly earned credits for success on probation. 36,000 people in Missouri reduced their terms by 14 months, 20% reduction in the number of people under supervision, and a steady reconviction rate. Louisiana, I think at the time Louisiana did this, they had the highest incarceration rate in the country. I think they're second now, by the way. Capped probation at 3 years, 30 days off for every 30 days of success, increased the ability to use administrative sanctions instead of just returning people to jail. They capped their revocation stays very severely. No days on the first revocation, no days on the second revocation, 15 days on the third, 30 days on the fourth, 45 days on the fifth, and never more than 45 days. And they saved money, they reduced incarceration, and recidivism went down. This is just a look at revocation caps in 3 red states. You can see Alaska's pretty severe caps, 3 days, 5 days, and 10 days for the first 3 revocations. Louisiana I already mentioned. And even Mississippi has got some pretty stark caps for people on probation if they get violated. So New York, we didn't do much with legislation. Most of what we did in New York, we did administratively. Some of it, there's really yet no explanation for. A whole bunch of what happened in New York happened before I got there and was just sort of part of New York's whole reduction in the number of people being incarcerated and handled formally. So it was an 81% decline. It went from around 68,000 people under supervision to around 13,000 people under supervision. New York's an 8.6 million person city, so it's about twice the size of Oregon. So even if, remember back those slides earlier on, even if there's 15,000 people on probation supervision in Oregon, you're supervising at slightly double the rate of New York City. And again, these data, these 13,000 include folks on misdemeanors, whereas Oregon's don't. By the way, at the end here, at 2017, what's happening when you look at dispositions of felony arrests is that only 4.3% of people who go to disposition, who go to sentencing, are being sentenced to probation in New York. 26%, 25.8% are being sentenced to either conditional or unconditional discharges, sort of a informal brand of probation. So this massive decline in the number of people on probation in New York came with a budget cut. We got a $23 million budget cut from about $97 million to about $75 million, or 73. And, but even so, that's not a 81% budget cut. And so because of that, we essentially had twice as much money when you control for inflation per person on probation. So that we used to lower caseloads and also go out and buy a bunch of services, mentoring, particularly focused on the young folks. Mayor Bloomberg had initiated the Young Men's Initiative, so we're able to focus a lot of our services on young people who had the highest rates of recidivism on probation. So we did mentoring programs, educational programs, workforce development programs, and opened up neighborhoods, offices in the neighborhoods that most of the people on probation came from. Previously, for example, in Brooklyn, which has 2.6 million residents, it's about the size of Chicago, we had one office. So that was just a house of pain. Everybody went to that office every week, and everybody was nasty to everyone else in that office, right? Starting with the scary folks that greeted you the moment you walked in. And so it's like, we got to stop that, right? And so now in Brooklyn, if you live in Bed-Stuy or Brownsville or East New York, which are the neighborhoods from which most folks come, you go to something small that looks like a nonprofit organization right in your neighborhood. There's not even a front sort of gulag or thing to walk through. You know, it's sort of, it's an entirely different environment. We were able to do that because we freed up money from having so many fewer people. What are the two things we're looking for probation and parole to do is divert people from jail and keep us safe. So 81% decline, is this a jailbreak, or conversely, are a lot more people getting locked up because there's so much less probation for them to go to? Well, no and no. 57% decrease in violent crime in New York City during this time, 55% decrease in jail usage. So much so, Rikers population is now below 8,000. It was 22,000 at its peak in the mid-90s. So that's a big decline, and the mayor's saying he's going to close Rikers Island in 10 years, and he said it 2 years ago, so 8 years from now, at which point they hope to have 5,000 people in Rikers. So we'll have gone down from 22,000 to 5,000. At the same time, probation was kind of disappearing. 45% decline in violations during my first 2 years that we were there. We just basically stopped violating people for ticky-tack fouls. So we got down to like 3% violation rate. Stopped testing people for marijuana, for example, which was really a trap. A lot of people, particularly the low-risk people, were only coming in once a month. And every year we'd randomly test them once. It was sort of a perfect environment for somebody to forget, or even if they didn't forget, to just smoke dope and then get violated, and then, you know, all sorts of stuff started kicking in. We increased the number of early discharge requests to the court sixfold, up to 17%. We were supervising 2/3 of the people on kiosks. Essentially, it meant you come in, stuck your hand in something that looked like an ATM, answered the same stupid 5 questions that it normally took you 2 hours to wait for a PO to answer, and went home. And we found that actually, for the low-risk folks who were still on probation, that they did better than they did when they waited that 2 hours and saw a PO and answered the same questions. And then eventually, when they did that long enough, we would go back to the judge and say, "Judge, he's been doing this, he's fine, can he go home?" And most of the times the judge said yes. And then I mentioned the change in the law. So 17% of folks were getting kicked early, 16% were getting the earlier sentences. So about 1/3 of folks weren't doing as much as they used to do. We asked the state to just tell us what happened, because, you know, the judges were nervous about this. You know, to make that active decision to release that many more people early from probation, it puts judges at risk. It puts us at risk, and it puts judges at risk, right? And a lot of what goes on in community corrections is managing that risk. And so we asked the state, you know, because we didn't want to do it ourselves, because then people could say that our thumb was on the scale, to look at what was happening to the people who discharged early versus what was happening to the people who finished their entire term on probation. And the people that maxed out, if you will, had a felony reconviction rate 1 year post-release of 4.3%, ones that were discharged early, 3%. Probably wasn't caused by the early discharge because we probably were discharging a better crop of folks, but you couldn't argue that it was a jailbreak. And then you can see our recidivism rates were down to not recidivism rates, our violation rates were down to 3.1% compared to a statewide average of 11%. So these are the kinds of data, your stakeholders really want to see. It's, really I should have flipped them and said, look, we're revoking fewer people, and look, we're not having, indefensible reconviction rates, which is what certainly Mayor Bloomberg wanted to see. So, what are some implications? Before I get into these bullet points, I think that we could be at a time with respect to this field where we can really step back and just try to remind ourselves of where it came from and what the whole purpose of it all was before we called it community corrections, right? I mean, you think about the correctionalization of the field and the move towards becoming a more supervision-focused environment. We even really kind of changed the name during the advent of mass incarceration and started calling it community corrections, almost as if it's jail in the community. And its original goal, and I think largely still its current goal, is to help people turn their lives around so that we experience more safety and they experience better outcomes. If that's really the goal, one thing I would urge you to do is, I know it's always tempting to want to chip away at the current thing and reform the current thing, but at some point, especially in an environment and a time like this, try to imagine if it just didn't exist. What would you invent to achieve those goals? And then stack that up against what you got. Would you go out and invent something that looks like current probation and current post-prison supervision? Or would you deploy at least some of those resources differently? Would you buy housing for people? Or would you buy an extra 100 POs? Would you buy drug treatment? Or would you revoke 1,000 people and spend that drug treatment money on reincarcerating them for 90 days each? Ask yourself those elemental questions at a time like this when you're able to step away from your day-to-day work. I think this is the time for that, if you will. Some things I think that need to be thrown into that pot are, for some people, just don't supervise them. Just use the informal sentences, make them go to a drug treatment program or anger management or thinking for change or whatever thing you think is the thing they need, and come back to the judge with a certificate saying I did it. Don't supervise them if you don't think they need to be supervised. When you do supervise, shorten and focus it. Imagine if we could get it down to just what we needed and we had the resources to do the things with the people we needed to do. I think all of that is probably, I don't know this because I don't know your data and know your situation, but I'm going to go out on a limb and say my bet is that if you shortened probation terms, shortened parole terms, focused on the people that needed to be on probation and parole, and captured at least part of the savings from jails and prisons that you're now spending revoking those folks, you could retool to an environment that would make all of y'all feel, like you've improved your lay of the land. Incentivize good behavior. There's a lot of research that shows that rewards are a better way to incentivize people than threats of punishment or actual punishment, particularly for the young folks, for the young adults, 18 to 25-year-olds, who make up a disproportionate share of who goes to prison in the country and who are the most racially disparate incarcerated population. So 18 and 19-year-olds imprisonment in America, they're imprisoned at, African Americans are imprisoned at 9 times the rate of whites. Overall, African Americans are imprisoned at about 5 times the rate of whites. So it's almost double the rates of disparity for the young folks. They respond particularly well to incentives and particularly poorly to threats of future harm. That's just the way we were when we were all young, right? I mean, think about yourselves, right? Like 5 years from now, if you behave well today, you're going to get a reward. Yeah, but behaving not well now is so much more fun then imagining that reward 5 years from now, and that kind of encapsulates a lot of what goes on with the young ones. Capping revocation terms and reducing revocations. I'd add reducing or eliminate fines. I don't know what people are thinking when they think that we can charge people on probation and parole fees for their time on probation. My POs hated trying to squeeze money out of people. We didn't have fees, and there was an effort to get us to charge fees. But even restitution, some folks, I mean, there was just only so much they were ever going to be able to pay. And I always thought we were particularly poor at collecting money, and it really warped the relationship between us and the people on probation. And then the fun part is trying to imagine if you could calculate the savings from all of that and get the governor and the legislature to give you at least a portion of it, what could you do to achieve the ultimate goals that you're trying to achieve? We're right now in the process of doing all of this stuff with parole in New York. I talked a lot about New York probation, but New York returns to prison for technical parole violations the second highest number of people in the country, New York State. Illinois is the only higher number. And 1 out of 5 people in Rikers Island right now are in on a violation. So it's on a state parole violation. So we have legislation right now that would give greater due process prior to detaining someone, that would cap probation, would cap revocation terms, would eliminate a number of categories even to even be eligible for a revocation, and then would capture that money and use it for housing and drug treatment, and even for microloans and economic development in some of New York State's most highly impacted communities. I strongly suspect that that's going to be a better public safety outcome than just the process of continuing to revoke so many people on probation and parole. So, quick conclusions. How am I doing on time, by the way? So I don't, yeah, 2. Okay, great. I was kind of like looking around. We weren't really able to discern where you sit relative to supervision rates. At best, you're in the middle of a bad pack. At worst, you're towards the top of that pack, particularly on parole. Explosive growth nationally, but there's been recent declines, nothing to brag about, like 15%, but we need to keep pushing that, and I think we will nationally. Probably doesn't improve public safety, may reduce it. I think that the numbers can be reduced safely, and there's plenty of state examples of this. Sort of at its base, people need help, not just to be watched closer and longer. And you can do this administratively or legislatively. Just one final thought, since I'm down at 2 minutes, and I think this is my last slide. Yep, some resources. So I've been doing a lot of speaking around the country, and I went to Pennsylvania and spoke to their state association of probation and parole commissioners. And it was not long after Meek Mill had been released from prison, and I don't know how closely you followed that, but what happened was he had become friendly with the owner of the Philadelphia 76ers because he was a local rap artist. He had been revoked in year 11 of his probation, so he had spent his whole adult life on probation and then got revoked for a technical in his 11th year, and a judge sentenced him to 2 to 4, and all the 76ers players and Jay-Z, who manages Meek Mill's rap career, just kind of went crazy and got incensed and got activated. And so they did get him released on bail pending a Supreme Court look at his case, and he the owner of the Sixers picked him up in a helicopter and flew him to the 76ers playoff game. This happened last year, where he rang a mock Liberty Bell in half court to start the game, and sat and watched the game with the governor and got a standing ovation from people who were probably paying minimum $250 a seat, right? I think the lousiest seat that day probably was going at $250. And I spoke to, I've spoken both to a group of prosecutors and a group of probation and parole commissioners about this moment, and said that part of what we need to recapture as a field is legitimacy. And nothing shows illegitimacy more than that moment in my mind of Meek Mill. This guy sat half court with the governor and watched a basketball game after he got a standing ovation from people paying $250 a seat, minimum, probably thousands for the floor seats. And that's not because his music was that great. Maybe it is, maybe it's not. I kind of don't get that music, but you know, some people like it, right? And it's not because he did a great thing. He beat back a system that is increasingly losing legitimacy, and it's not just losing legitimacy amongst the people in the hood where Meek Mill came from, right? It's losing legitimacy amongst people spending thousands of dollars to see a basketball game. And that ought to disturb all of us. That's a much less quantifiable thing. But what do the communities whose sons and daughters and husbands and wives who are getting locked up for ticky-tack fouls feel about this? And how is that spreading itself to even people that can afford expensive basketball tickets? That's a bad piece of legitimacy to lose. This field should be about helping to restore people and to remove them from the harsher exposure to incarceration, not being a feeder system into that and not being a mini deprivation of liberty in its own right, particularly when that's an unnecessary thing for it to do. So that's the challenge I leave you all with today. Hope you can figure that out. You got a day and a half, so it should be a piece of cake. And I thank you very much for inviting me to be here.